Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Khoury. He is an assistant teaching professor of philosophy at Arizona State University. He works primarily at the intersection of moral philosophy, moral psychology, and metaphysics on issues surrounding free will and moral responsibility. And today we're focusing mostly on moral responsibility, punishment, forgiveness, and other related topics. So, Dr. Khoury, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to have you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so I would like to start with this question that is sort of related to moral responsibility in a way, but we have this common idea that agents can be blameworthy only for acts that are morally wrong. But is there any issue with that claim?
Good. Yeah. So I guess I'll start by saying a little bit about how I and many philosophers kind of
Hmm.
understand these kinds of notions.
Okay.
So first of all, we have rightness and wrongness,
Hmm.
and these are typically understood to be like evaluations of actions. So murder is wrong. That's a kind of action. Its kind of normative or ethical status is that it's wrong.
Yeah.
Giving to charity when you can easily do so and it will create some good in the world is the right sort of thing to do. So again, that's a kind of action. And then the idea is that its normative or ethical status is that it's right, morally right.
Hmm.
And so there's different views on what makes right acts right or wrong acts wrong.
Hmm.
So for example, many of you will have heard of the theory utilitarianism.
Yeah.
So utilitarianism says that here's what makes an act right. It produces the most overall happiness. And then there's other sorts of views, kind of common going views for rightness and wrongness. So another is virtue ethics, frequently associated with Aristotle. And then Kant's moral philosophy is another account of what makes right acts right or wrong acts wrong. So moral responsibility, by contrast, which I take to be the extent to which someone is blameworthy or praiseworthy,
Hmm.
this is a different sort of evaluation. So rather than targeting like an action, most fundamentally, it targets people, or philosophers say agents, beings with a capacity for action.
Right.
So moral responsibility then is kind of commonly construed in terms of the appropriateness of certain reactive attitudes. That's a phrase that goes back to a 20th century philosopher named P.F. Strawson. So if someone's blameworthy, well, then they're worthy of blame or blaming attitudes. And these are attitudes like resentment, indignation, or in the first personal case, guilt. On the other hand, if someone's praiseworthy, then they're worthy of different sort of attitudes, right? Praising attitudes, gratitude, appreciation, things like this. So that's kind of how I understand rightness and wrongness on the one hand, and then blameworthiness and praiseworthiness on the other hand.
Hmm.
So that claim that you mentioned kind of links blameworthiness very closely with wrongness.
Yeah.
So it says that only wrong acts can be blameworthy, which is to say that wrongness is a necessary condition of blameworthiness. That blameworthiness is limited to wrong acts. And so
Hmm.
the problem for me with that kind of claim is that because these are just kind of fundamentally different sorts of evaluations, what matters for blameworthiness isn't necessarily what matters for wrongness. And if you link them very tightly in that way, then it turns out that blameworthiness can be affected by factors that it seems like shouldn't be able to affect it. And then that gives rise to what I would call a problematic form of moral luck.
Hmm.
So the idea here to kind of illustrate and give some concrete cases here. So I think it's plausible that there's cases in which a person's blameworthy, but they didn't do anything wrong. So that would be what philosophers call a counterexample to that principle or that claim that you mentioned initially.
Hmm.
So for a first sort of case, we might imagine a case in which someone acts with sinister motives or morally criticizable motives, but kind of by luck gets it right. They accidentally get it right. So for one of many examples we can kind of cook up, imagine someone who's involved in a road rage incident, right? So someone cuts them off, they get flooded with anger, and they shoot and kill the driver that cut them off, right? Clearly a blameworthy action, right? But it could turn out that the person who died was, unbeknownst to the killer, like a serial killer, right? So it's like good that the person was killed because they would have gone on to, say, commit many more murders. So at least on some accounts of rightness and wrongness, like on utilitarianism, that act would be counted as right. And so if we accept that common claim, then we could not say that the person's blameworthy for that road rage incident. But intuitively, that seems incorrect. And then for a second sort of case, I think we can think of cases in which a person, again, acts with sinister or morally criticizable motives, but knowingly does the right thing. So it's like they know they are doing the right thing. They know it's the right thing, but they can still act for bad motivations. And the idea here is that for many acts that are right, they're right because the considerations in favor of them outweigh the considerations against them. But a person might act just purely in virtue of the considerations that count against the action. So, for example, here we might imagine a case of the sadistic pediatrician. So this is a person who just hates kids, wants nothing more than to cause kids pain, and thinks, what career should I go into? I know, pediatrics, because then I can give kids shots all day long, hurt them, and no one will suspect a thing, kind of a loophole that I've found here. So, so the pediatrician does the right thing by giving children their needed shots and vaccinations, but does so only because they want to cause pain. And again, so here it's like, well, intuitively, I wouldn't want to be around that person, right? I would react to that person with blaming attitudes, and I would think that that would be the appropriate response. But they're doing the right thing. And so just as a person might be blameworthy for doing something that isn't wrong, we kind of have the flip side when we turn to praiseworthiness as well. So a person might indeed be praiseworthy for doing something that is wrong, right? So for example, if they're reasonably trying to do the right thing. So suppose you give someone what you reasonably believe to be a very needed and life-saving medication, but it's been secretly replaced with poison, or maybe unbeknownst to you, the person has a fatal allergy to that medication. There's no way that you could have known. So in that sort of case, still, it seems like to me the person's worthy maybe of praising attitudes, even though what they did wasn't right, at least on many moral theories, many theories of rightness and wrongness. And so the lesson that I take from thinking about these sorts of cases is that for me, what matters for blameworthiness and praiseworthiness is really like exclusively a person's internal psychological states, their character, their motives, their values, these sorts of things. But on most moral theories, rightness and wrongness are not exclusively a function of the person, the agent's internal psychological state. So it's not true on utilitarianism. That's not true in virtue ethics. Arguably, it's not true on Kantian moral theory as well. And so instead, for many of these theories anyways, what matters for rightness and wrongness is some other thing, some effect out in the world. At least it's not only a person's internal psychological states. So I defend kind of an internalist. And so given those facts, then linking blameworthiness very tightly to wrongness will lead to what I call problematic forms of moral luck. And so this is when blameworthiness can be affected by factors that are, from the agent's perspective, just a matter of luck. So for example, right, for the road raging driver, it's just a matter of luck that the victim turned out to be a serial killer. So it seems like that fact shouldn't be able to affect the blameworthiness of that person.
Yes, so I was just about to ask you, because you mentioned the three biggest moral theories out there. I think we could call them, that is, virtue ethics, utilitarianism / consequentialism, and deontology or Kantian ethics. And I was just trying, as you were talking, I was trying to remember if any of them had something specific to say about internal states and intentionality and motives and all of that. And of course, the consequentialists / the utilitarians, I don't think they even care about that at all. The Kantian, remember, because I can't really remember a precise for example, book or author of any of those big moral theories that really talks much about internal states. Am I wrong here or not?
So it's sometimes addressed by some of these theories. So I think John Stuart Mill, who is one of the famous defenders of utilitarianism,
Okay.
kind of like agrees or seems to make some comments suggesting some degree of agreement with kind of the line of thought that I'm developing.
Okay.
So Mill says that the consequences matter very much or determine the rightness or wrongness of the action, but they don't kind of directly matter for the moral worth of the person. So insofar as by moral worth, he means something like moral responsibility, then he, as one defender of utilitarianism, might be willing to, he might not want to accept that claim that only wrong acts can be blameworthy. A kind of big theme of deontology, deontological accounts of moral responsibility or moral worth is that it's about doing the right thing for the right reasons. And so that's kind of one step in the direction of thinking that what matters for responsibility is your motivations. But insofar as, you know, that's kind of an expression of this idea that only, not all right acts are praiseworthy, but praiseworthiness is limited to right acts. And so insofar as, and I'm not a Kantian expert, so I'm not totally sure whether I have the right interpretation of Kantian ethics. But insofar as the deontological theory does not say that the right thing is limited to, or the factors that determine rightness or wrongness are not limited to our internal psychological states, then you'll get this problem that I'm kind of suggesting.
Yeah, I was also asking you that because it seems to me that at least when I hear these big ethicists talk about what's morally good or bad, they tend to focus a lot on the acts themselves. I mean, either the consequences of the acts or the acts themselves based on some a priori values, for example, but it's mostly about the acts and if the person herself had some good or bad intention, as long as they did what's morally right to do. I mean, they don't seem to care much about intentionality, motives, and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you know, their focus is, I think, a different sort of thing than as someone who works on responsibility, what my focus is. So, you know, if someone does something good, if they add value to the world, say by saving lives or producing some good effect out there, then they might be willing to stop their inquiry into the responsibility of the person. They're like, well, goodness was produced, so we might not have any interest in pursuing the question of responsibility further at that point.
And so, are there any traditionally, let's say in ethics, have people focused much on moral responsibility itself? Or is that a more recent issue that people care about?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, so discussion of responsibility kind of historically is tied up with the free will debate. So that debate has been, you know, going on for 3,000 years. And one way to think of free will is that it's the sense of control that moral responsibility requires. It's whatever kind of control we would have to have if we were to be morally responsible for our actions. So a lot of the interest kind of in the free will debate, I think, is generated from interest in responsibility or interpersonal relations, whether punishment makes sense. There's been kind of, I guess, in the second half of the 20th century with this paper by P.F. Strawson, which is called Freedom and Resentment, there was kind of renewed interest in looking at moral responsibility and kind of directly looking at it, somewhat apart from what interests we might have in free will. And so I would say that there's been a bit of a resurgence in looking at responsibility kind of directly since then.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not that people in human societies haven't been caring about attributing moral responsibility, either praise or blame, for a very, very long time, I guess, as far as we exist as humans, right? So I
Absolutely.
was just trying to understand if really, when it comes to the philosophers themselves, how much they've been interested in this specific topic traditionally.
Yeah, many historical philosophers will say something or other about it. So Kant does have an account of moral worth, kind of, as I was describing earlier, that for an act to have moral worth or to be praiseworthy, you must do the right thing from the right reasons.
Yeah.
So there are elements of it kind of throughout the history of philosophy.
So moving on to a sort of related comes to criminal attempts specifically. I mean, sometimes it seems that really, for example, in the case of murder, really committing murder or just attempting murder but unsuccessfully, sometimes it's a matter of luck. So, do you think that when it comes to thinking about punishing people, that really matters? I mean, because sometimes if you attempted murder but you just ended up not killing the person out of luck, I mean, do you think that should really matter when evaluating those cases?
Yeah, good. So you've kind of brought up what's known as the problem of criminal attempts or the puzzle of criminal attempts.
Yeah.
So as a kind of starting point here, right, in most penal systems across the world, right, murder gets punished much more severely than attempted murder, right?
Yeah.
In the US, if you're convicted of first degree murder, you might face the death penalty. While on the other hand, right, if you're convicted of attempted murder, you might get a much more lenient sentence of 10, 15 years,
Yeah.
possibly something like that. So whether you're successful or not makes a big difference to the punishment you're kind of eligible for. But then it seems like success or failure is often just is a matter of luck, right? Whether the intended victim happened to be wearing a bulletproof vest underneath their suit, the skill of the surgeons attending to the victim, right? If the surgeons are like super good, they might save the life of the intended victim, and then there is no murder. Then it's just attempted murder.
Yeah.
And then kind of a influential example coming from Thomas Nagel in a paper called Moral Luck. He introduced this idea that maybe after the trigger is pulled, a bird flies into the path of the bullet, intercepts the bullet, and the victim is spared. So it seems like whether a murderous attempt is successful or unsuccessful can often come down to luck, and I might even argue always comes down to luck. And then to kind of broaden the scope of the problem, we can notice that it's not just consequences or results that are attempted in which you have the same problem, right? So negligent drivers or drunk drivers who kill get much more severe punishment than equally negligent drivers who don't, or drunk drivers who don't. But again, whether there's like a pedestrian in the road as the driver careens by is not something that's in their control. So it's a matter of luck as far as the driver is concerned. So the problem's a little bit bigger than just attempts, although the literature itself kind of cashes this out in terms of attempts. So then this raises the question, right? Are the successful more blameworthy? Are successful murderers in general more blameworthy than their given that success or failure seems like it can come down to luck? Are negligent drivers who kill more blameworthy than equally negligent drivers who don't? And so to kind of get a grip on this question, or to try and engage this question, kind of philosophers like to run thought experiments, which are, kind of analogous to a scientific experiment. So we try and kind of hold all factors fixed that we don't want to test for. We just wiggle the test factor, and we see if it makes a difference in our experiment. So if we want to know whether results or consequences matter, then we can compare two cases in which everything's exactly the same except for this one thing, whether the result materializes. And if altering whether the result occurs leads to kind of a change in our judgment of blameworthiness, then that's some evidence that results matter for blameworthiness. And
Right.
if you don't get any change in blameworthiness when you compare these cases while wiggling whether the result occurs or not, then that would be some evidence that results don't matter for blameworthiness. So to do this, we can like imagine a case in which an assassin very carefully aims his rifle at some intended victim, pulls the trigger. So there's the attempt, it's a completed attempt. And then in the first scenario, it's just kind of a regular case with no funny business and the victim is shot and killed. But in the second scenario, again, the trigger's already been pulled. So all factors up to and including the movement of the finger are identical across the two cases. But in the second scenario, imagine that a bird flies into the path of the bullet and the intended victim is spared harm.
Mm-hmm.
So if you kind of reflect on this case and you try and imagine it vividly, for many people, and including myself, it's highly intuitive that they're equally blameworthy. And some experimental philosophers have kind of run experiments and surveys testing this kind of judgment. It's a fairly robust judgment that people have. And the idea here is, well, how could the mere presence of the bird make a difference to the assassin's blameworthiness, right? It doesn't seem like he could cite that factor as a genuine mitigating or excusing factor. He's like, well, there was a bird in the path of the bullet. You shouldn't be so mad at me, right? That seems incorrect. So regardless of the presence or absence of the bird, right, the assassin has the same morally objectionable motives. And if you think that therefore they're equally blameworthy, kind of as I do, then that's to reject what philosophers call resultant moral luck. And so resultant moral luck exists if the mere results of our actions can affect blameworthiness. And then this kind of line of thought suggests that they can't. Okay, so that's kind of moral responsibility. And now how does this relate back to punishment? So, so one view of punishment is called retributivism. And on that view, punishment is about giving people what they deserve. And what they deserve is proportional to their blameworthiness. So retributivism links deserved punishment to blameworthiness. And then if we reject resultant moral luck, as I think we should, and accept retributivism about punishment, which I'm actually kind of not sure about, then yes, equal attempts should be punished equally, regardless of success. And notice here that the kind of primary motivation for this position is this rejection of resultant moral luck. If there were resultant moral luck, right, if that was a genuine feature of the normative landscape, if it did exist, then it's easy to see why we should punish success more than failure, right? Because the successful just are more blameworthy than the unsuccessful, purely in virtue of their success. So it seems like this debate about criminal attempts largely comes down to a debate about resultant moral luck.
But if we reach the conclusion philosophically that the people who attempted murder but were unsuccessful are as blameworthy as the successful murderers, do you think that should necessarily have legal ramifications? I mean, how basically do you look at the relationship between the work done by moral philosophers and ethicists and the legal and penal system?
Yeah, so I think moral philosophy has the luxury of being able to be ideal, whereas thinking about punishment and actually like legal punishment has to engage with kind of realities of the world, right? Such as like, can you implement that system? How cost effective is it? So that's why I say like it kind of depends on whether you accept this view of punishment called retributivism, which just kind of directly links deserved punishment with blameworthiness. But we might not accept retributivism. And then, some other factors that might play into it is it could turn out to be empirically true that as a matter of fact, success is pretty good evidence for more blameworthy psychological states. And so there's a strong enough correlation in the real world that would justify punishing success in general more than mere attempted murder. So it'll depend on these other kind of factors, I think.
Yeah, also because I was just thinking that we're focusing mostly on retributivism here, but And a possible alternative would be what people have been calling restorative justice, right? And I'm not sure, I haven't looked into that sort of literature. I'm not sure to what extent it works and in what specific cases it works or not, but perhaps at least in the case of an attempted unsuccessful murder, there would at least be some more space, hypothetical space there for restorative justice, because at least the potential victim is still or would be still alive.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, and again, that's kind of to say that there's factors beyond the blame, that facts other than the blameworthiness facts might determine what kind of punishment is appropriate, right? So if the victim is still alive, then there might be some possibility for a restorative process there.
Mm-hmm. And so I would like for you to tell us now a bit about this idea of the penal lottery. So what is this about?
Yeah, so for a bit of background here, so the idea of a penal lottery comes from David Lewis, who is one of the kind of most influential 20th century analytic philosophers, widely known for his work in metaphysics, developing semantics for possible worlds, this kind of idea of thinking about modality in terms of possible worlds. Yeah. But he's also done some very interesting work in philosophy of law and ethics. So he wrote this paper in 1989, or was published in 1989, called The Punishment That Leaves Something to Chance, where he takes up the problem of criminal attempts. And he defends the idea that it makes sense to punish success more than failure, even if the successful are not necessarily more blameworthy than the unsuccessful. Like even if you reject resultant moral luck, as I've kind of indicated my sympathies towards. So just as a little bit of personal background, so I came across this paper maybe 10 years or so ago when I was teaching a course. And I just thought, this is the most clever thing I've ever seen. And at that point, I was already kind of convinced that because equal attempts are equally blameworthy, they should be punished equally. Let me just, sorry, I have motion activated lights that drive me crazy every day.
No problem.
So Lewis's argument gave me real pause about my own view. And I was like, oh gosh, have I been wrong about this? And so I got kind of obsessed with it, trying to see if the argument was sound or if there was a problem somewhere. And then I also recommend, for interested viewers, I'd highly recommend that paper as just a kind of fun, lively, and engaging piece of philosophy. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what is the penal lottery? So imagine that two criminals make equal murderous attempts. And suppose that they subject their victim to a 50% chance of death. And to kind of make this precise, imagine that they both kind of engage in this grim game of Russian roulette, where they load 3 bullets into their 6-shooter revolver, they spin the cylinder and pull the trigger while aiming it at an innocent victim. So it's clear that there's a 50% risk of death. In one case, suppose that the victim dies. In the other case, the hammer of the gun lands on an empty chamber and the victim is spared harm. And then suppose that they're both tried and convicted of this attempt of subjecting their victim, the intended victim, to a 50% chance of death. Okay, so how are we going to punish them for the attempt, crucially, for Lewis? So Lewis imagines the possibility that we punish them for the attempt itself with a penal lottery in which they have to face the exact same risk that they subjected their victim to. So he imagines this kind of grim game of drawing straws. So on the steps of the gallows, the criminal must draw straws. And if a short straw is drawn, put to death. If they get a long straw, they're released. And the idea here is that we tailor the odds that the criminal face in this penal lottery to the odds of harm that they subjected the victim to. So because they were both convicted of subjecting their victim to a 50% chance of death, well, then from the bundle of straws, there's going to be 5 short straws and 5 long straws. So it's a 50% chance then that they get executed. If, however, they were convicted of subjecting their victim to a 60% risk of harm, well, then we just add, we take one long straw and cut it. And so then there's 6 short straws and 4 long. So suppose that the first straw is a short straw, and the second straw is a long straw. So the first is put to death. The second is released. Okay, so now we can ask, so that's the penal lottery. Now we ask, is that just? Has that served justice? And Lewis's point is that, well, it kind of seems like it does kind of met out retributive justice. And even if you think that the 2 criminals are equally blameworthy, even if you reject resultant moral luck, right? They both face the same penal lottery with the same odds. And so there's a kind of a clear sense in which the penal lottery respects the retributive principle of lex talionis, or an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Okay, so that's the regular penal lottery. And then Lewis goes through a series of cases where he makes some alterations to the lottery, but says it doesn't matter, doesn't make a difference to whether the lottery is just or unjust. This is like the really clever bit, I think. So in the initial case, the drawing of straws occurs after we held the trial and after the criminals were convicted of making that attempt. But Lewis notices that we could also hold the drawing before the trial, right? We do the drawing of straws before the trial, and then we hold the trial to see whether the criminal is convicted. And if they are convicted, then they have to face the lottery according to which straw was drawn. I think, well, look, if a short straw is drawn before the trial, then why would we even bother carrying out the trial? There'd be no point, because, right, if the alleged criminal is not convicted, they're released, and if they are convicted, they're released. So either way, it doesn't matter. And the solution here for Lewis is to make the lottery what he calls impure. So instead of freedom for the winners, you give them a short prison sentence. You don't give them death like you do if they draw the short straw, but you give them a little bit of punishment. Okay. And again, Lewis thinks at this stage that change from a pure lottery to an impure lottery doesn't affect kind of fundamentally whether the lottery is just or not just. And then the next step in a series of cases is turbinizing device, right? So there's nothing, it doesn't have to be drawing of straws, right? It could be some other way to conduct the lottery, like you could roll a dice. If the odds were 50-50, you could flip a coin, right? And that wouldn't seem to make a difference as to whether the lottery was just or unjust. And then, so Lewis suggests that instead of drawing straws, we could employ what he calls a reenactment of the crime. So the thought here is like we hold a play in which we have actors and they reenact kind of the events of the crime. And then we look to see what results happened in the reenactment. So if the victim in the reenactment dies, then the criminal has lost his lottery and is therefore put to death. If the victim in the reenactment survives, then the criminal has won his lottery and gets a short prison sentence. And notice here that if you get the reenactment perfect, might be hard to do, but if you get it perfect, then the odds of harm in the reenactment will perfectly match up with the odds of harm in the actual criminal event itself. Okay, but of course, this doesn't seem very practical, right? It's going to be hard to hold a reenactment, let alone a perfect reenactment. And here's like the punchline for Lewis. Well, just look, here's an easy solution. Just replace reenactment with enactment. Just use the actual criminal event as its own lottery. So if the actual victim dies, then the criminal has lost his lottery. And if the actual victim survives, then the criminal has won his lottery. And here, we get a perfect match in those odds just by default, because we just have one event that's playing 2 roles, right? It's the criminal event for which the criminal is being punished, but it's also its own lottery event. And then this final case, Lewis says, is just the current system. That's what we have. It's an impure penal lottery by enactment. So we can understand the current system along these lines. And then he thinks if we do, it's not obvious that it's unjust, right? So he thinks you start with that the first penal lottery case in which they draw straws on the steps of the gallows, and you say, well, that doesn't seem obviously wrong. It's at least tricky to say why that would be unjust. And he thinks that same judgment transfers down to each of these cases, the final case just being the current system. So he thinks it makes sense, or at least it doesn't obviously not make sense, to punish success more than failure, even if the successful are not necessarily more blameworthy than the unsuccessful. So that's Lewis's argument for the justice of the kind of current system that appeals to the penal lottery. So what's the problem with it? Is there a problem with it? So in Lewis's paper, it kind of gets buried within some of the technical details related to different notions of risk or probability. But the basic issue is that it requires that the severity of the punishment that is deserved is simply a matter of the objective risk imposed on the victim, because only then could we use the criminal event itself as its own lottery. But I think it's not plausible that objective risk imposed kind of is what determines blameworthiness or criminal desert. So for one, epistemic considerations seem to clearly matter, right? So if you believe that the gun's loaded and you pull the trigger, but someone has secretly replaced all the bullets with blanks, this greatly reduces the objective risk of harm, right? Maybe from like 100% to 0%, but it doesn't, at least if you have that intuition that we should reject resultant moral luck, it seems like it doesn't directly affect the blameworthiness of the person, right? That person still tried to cause a murder or to cause a killing. So the problem is that the objective risk imposed, which for Lewis determines the severity of the penal lottery that the criminal has to face, is just as much a matter of luck as is success or failure. So I think Lewis has not delivered on his promise to offer us an explanation of why it makes sense to punish success more severely than failure that doesn't just kind of directly appeal to the existence of resultant moral luck, which is like a very controversial claim in the debate, because, or at least something close enough to resultant moral luck, like luck and objective risk imposed.
So I would like to ask you a little bit about forgiveness now. And obviously, the only people we can forgive are the blameworthy. I mean, it wouldn't make sense to forgive the praiseworthy because there's nothing to forgive there. But but it seems that there might be some problem there because the blameworthy are the ones that are appropriately blamed and not forgiven. So how do we deal with this issue?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So I like kind of philosophical puzzles or paradox, kind of in the way that you're just suggesting. I've found that idea of forgiveness to be kind of puzzling or paradoxical. So there's some people have argued that there's a full-blown paradox of forgiveness. And it's kind of like just what you were saying. So it seems like forgiveness has to have a point, right? You haven't done anything bad to me. And if I were like, Ricardo, I forgive you, you would just be like, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. So it seems like forgiveness has to be directed at the blameworthy, right? For forgiveness to have a point, has to be directed at the blameworthy. But if a person's blameworthy, well, then they're worthy of blame. And forgiveness is not blaming or ceasing to blame. So if a person is blameworthy, then it seems like that blame is justified, not forgiveness. And so the conclusion here is just that appropriate forgiveness is impossible, like never occurs. Only the blameworthy can be appropriately forgiven, but the blameworthy are worthy of blame, not forgiveness.
Right.
So in some of my work, so how do we deal with this paradox or puzzle of forgiveness? So in some of my work, I've drawn a distinction between what I call synchronic and diachronic responsibility, or synchronic, and one form of which is synchronic and diachronic blameworthiness. So the idea here is that, say, synchronic blameworthiness is a person's blameworthiness for an action at the time of its occurrence, like at that moment.
Yeah.
And then diachronic blameworthiness is a person's blameworthiness for an action at some time after. So any time that we're considering the question of a person's blameworthiness for something in the past, this is going to be a question of diachronic blameworthiness. So they have these different temporal dimensions. So synchronic blameworthiness is blameworthiness at the time of the action, while diachronic blameworthiness kind of stretches out over time. So it's blameworthiness now for something in the past, or blameworthiness at a later time for an action at an earlier time. So that's the distinction. And many philosophers would think that this is a distinction that doesn't make a difference, because they think that blameworthiness can never diminish over time. So if that's true, then diachronic blameworthiness would always be exactly equal to synchronic blameworthiness for an action. Mm-hmm. And so they think that because they think that the past can't be changed, which is correct, and that your blameworthiness is set in stone, which that part I reject. So I think that blameworthiness can diminish and extinguish over time. So diachronic blameworthiness for a given act might come apart from synchronic blameworthiness for that act. So as an analogy to kind of get a grip on the sort of distinction I have in mind here, mm-hmm. So here's one property that I have. So I have the property of being from California. Now I'm not in California, I'm in Arizona, adjacent to California in the southwestern United States, but I still have the property of being from California, right? But no matter where I go in the world or how old I get, I will still have that property. It's sticky. I can't lose it. And it's robust. It doesn't diminish. I will always have that property, can't lose it, and I'll always have it to the same degree. So that's one kind of property that people have. Mm-hmm. But here's another sort of property. Consider the product is not sticky and robust in the way the property of being from California is, right? So the property of being a fast swimmer is one that does diminish over time, right, as people age, and it can ultimately be lost, right? You can lose the ability to swim at all. So the property of being a fast swimmer is a property that can clearly change over time. It can diminish and even fully extinguish over time. So then the question is, which category does the property of being blameworthy fall into? And on my view, the property of being blameworthy is more like the property of being a fast swimmer than it is the property of being from California. So in my view, blameworthiness can change over time depending on what one is like, just in the same way that being a fast swimmer can change over time depending on one's physical abilities. And so if we kind of have this distinction in our toolbox, then I think we can use it to resolve the kind of puzzle of forgiveness. So while it's true that we can only forgive those who were blameworthy, those who were synchronically blameworthy at some earlier point in time, they might not now be blameworthy at all. And if they're not now blameworthy, then we should no longer blame them. And for me, that counts as forgiveness. So they should be forgiven. So on this approach, appropriate forgiveness is a matter of kind of tracking blameworthiness across time. And someone who becomes not blameworthy for a past act is someone who deserves or warrants forgiveness.
And how about the notion of repentance? Do you think it would apply here, at least to the extent that particular morally wrong acts would be, people would consider people able to repent for them? Because, of course, there are some acts that perhaps people consider that the blameworthy person went too far and there's no possible repentance there, but at least for the acts that people can repent for, do you think it would apply here?
Yeah. So the notion of repentance is kind of closely bound up with the idea of forgiveness. And the idea here is that kind of intuitively, it seems like repentance, if someone genuinely repents, then it seems like that provides some reason, moral reason, or a reason of the right kind to forgive. So it's like if someone repents, that's a good reason to consider maybe forgiving them. And so why would repentance have that kind of normative power? And so my answer to that is that when we genuinely repent, one changes psychologically in ways that just directly reduce blameworthiness. So the idea is that repentance just directly reduces blameworthiness. So why is that? Well, repentance involves breaking certain psychological connections with one's past self, as one way to put it. You kind of dissolve the motivations and the values that led to the initial act. in question. You might no longer, if the genuinely repentant, presumably, are people who are no longer disposed to act in those bad ways anymore.
Yeah.
And so, on my view, that just directly and straightforwardly makes the person less diachronically blameworthy for the earlier action. Right? In the same way that losing the ability to move your legs might just directly reduce the extent to which you're a fast swimmer. So the repentant then deserve forgiveness simply because they've become less blameworthy for the past action. And so I think this makes sense. I mean, for me, it seems intuitively plausible. And again, we can like run a thought experiment here, right? If you compare the repentant to right? If you compare a case in which someone is genuinely repentant for some bad act, and you compare that to another case where the person committed exactly the same sort of initial act, but they are not repentant, it seems like obvious that the repentant deserve less blame than the non-repentant. At least I would make that case.
Mm-hmm. And how exactly can we determine how much punishment someone deserves?
Yeah, so as I've kind of alluded to earlier, I'm less confident about my views on punishment than I am about my views on moral responsibility. So I've kind of settled views on responsibility. So on my view, synchronic responsibility or synchronic blameworthiness or praiseworthiness is a matter of quality of will. This is another phrase that comes from P.F. Strawson's essay, Freedom and Resentment. So quality of will, for me, is a matter of the internal psychological states of the person at the time of the action, and particular psychological states at that time, like ones that were relevant to why they were blameworthy in the first place. So values and concerns as expressed in the action. And so appeal to kind of these internal states as being the determinant of synchronic blameworthiness is supposed to provide an explanation for why resultant moral luck doesn't exist. So it's kind of like, I want my theory of responsibility to not allow for resultant moral luck. And here's a theory that does that and provides, I think, a satisfying explanation as to why that is so. Right? So the results of our actions don't affect our motives, right? The motives that because the motives occur first, right? There's no backwards causation here. So because the results of our actions don't affect the quality of will with which a person acts, then that's why they can't affect responsibility. So the idea here is that responsibility at the time of the action is fully determined by your quality of will, which is kind of the motivations that you have. And then diachronic responsibility, in turn, is a matter of the persistence of those psychological states across time, or the persistence of that quality of will. So here, if we're inquiring into the question of diachronic responsibility, we're going to be asking questions like this. Do the values and concerns that were expressed in the action, do those persist across time? Have they diminished? Have they been extinguished or eliminated altogether? So in my view, if they persist, which they frequently do, then blameworthiness persists undiminished. If those psychological states diminish, then we're going to get a corresponding diminishment in blameworthiness. And even in some cases, they might be entirely eliminated, in which a person might be no longer blameworthy at all for some earlier action that they used to be blameworthy for. Okay, so that's kind of my view on responsibility. And then if we accept this retributive view about punishment, where you link deserved punishment to blameworthiness, then we can get an account of punishment, where deserved punishment for an action is kind of tailored to one's current degree of blameworthiness for the action. And I think that maybe that will result in the most plausible version of retributivism. But kind of, as I said before, I'm not sure whether I want to accept retributivism. So it seems like other sorts of factors other than blameworthiness might matter for punishment, like deterrence, things like that.
And so one more question related to punishment, and then we'll move on to other things. So is there any amount of punishment that can render the blameworthy not blameworthy anymore?
Yeah, so that's, I think, a really interesting question that brings up some metaphysical issues that I think we have to kind of have a good grasp of if we're trying to think about responsibility and punishment over time. So my answer is that yes, some kinds of punishment can eliminate blameworthiness, though it might be for sort of surprising reasons. So suppose that there's a blameworthy person who's been convicted of a crime, and they've been sentenced to death, and they've been put to death.
Yeah.
Okay. And let's also assume that death is non-existent. It's annihilation. Let's suppose for the moment anyways that there's no afterlife, so death is just, you're gone. Okay. So if the person's been put to death, then I think this is true. I think that this is an undeniable metaphysical fact. After the person's been put to death, there's just no one around that is at that later time blameworthy for the earlier action, right? So after the person's been put to death for the crime, if we were to survey all the people on earth, all the people in the world, no one would be the person who is blameworthy for that crime, right? That person's just not around any longer. Yeah. So in this way, I think that death just kind of necessarily extinguishes blameworthiness, as well as, you know, all our other intrinsic properties. Mm-hmm. And I think that this kind of explains, like, it seems like there's a unique sort of tragedy to crimes like murder-suicides, or crimes in which the perpetrator of the crime dies in the crime or shortly after, right? So there's something uniquely tragic about that. And I think this is why, right? The person's just not around to be held responsible. Mm-hmm. And that is disappointing to us. So if blameworthiness is extinguished kind of necessarily when the person no longer persists, or when the person no longer exists, then to me this suggests that persisting blameworthiness is a matter of the persistence of something or other about the person. So on some views, it's simply a matter of whether the person itself persists through time, that is, whether the person is still alive or not. This turns out to be a matter of what philosophers call the question of personal identity over time, what makes a person the same person over time.
Right.
So on that view, blameworthiness persists undiminished so long as the person still persists or is still alive. So on that view, the property of being blameworthy is like the property, or my property, of being from California. It's not one you can lose. You will retain it up until you go out of existence. Now, I don't accept that view because I think that people can persist, but yet change in ways that are relevant to blameworthiness. So if you kind of dig into the literature on personal identity, it turns out that on all the leading accounts of personal identity is compatible not just with a great deal of change, but with complete psychological change. Like it's compatible with not retaining any of your psychological states whatsoever, so long as it's gradual enough. Right. This turns out to be true on both like biological and psychological approaches to personal identity. So in my view, persisting blameworthiness, instead of being a matter of the persistence of the person as construed by these accounts of personal identity, it's a matter of the persistence of certain aspects of their psychology, right? So if the morally deficient values and concerns that explain why the person was initially blameworthy persist, then blameworthiness persists. If they've diminished, then blameworthiness has diminished. And if they've been eliminated, then so too is blameworthiness. Okay, and then back to the issue of punishment. Insofar as punishment might affect those psychological states, like whether the person has those values or concerns, then punishment can affect blameworthiness, though the relation here is going to be kind of indirect. So that's what I think is going on in the case of death, or in the case of punishment by the death penalty, right? When the execution just eliminates all of those psychological states, and so there just is no one around anymore that's blameworthy for that act. But it might happen in less kind of extreme ways as well. So blameworthiness could also be affected by punishments that result in relevant psychological change, as when a criminal has been reformed or rehabilitated, such that they no longer retain those problematic aspects of their psychology that led to the bad action in the first place.
But I mean, since you mentioned the issue surrounding personal identity there, which I am more or less familiar in the way that philosophers deal with them, I mean, because sometimes when people improve their moral character, let's say people make statements like, "Oh, she's no longer the same person. She's a better person now." I mean, to the extent that you tie here issues surrounding punishment with personal identity, would you consider that if over time the person improves and changes their psychological traits, the ones that are relevant here to ethics, morality, and punishment, that would also constitute a change in terms of their personal identity? Because since we have this sort of folk intuitive psychological approach to saying that the person is a different person now, would that have any bearing in terms of the moral philosophy here or not?
Yeah, excellent. So there's different sense. So we mean different things when we talk, or we can mean different things when we speak of a person's self, or whether the person's the same person or not the same person over time, right? So if you consider the sentence, he is not the same person that he once was, right? The first occurrence of he seems to imply that there is identity that holds from the earlier time to the later time. That's kind of the strict sense of numerical identity. The second sense is something like a person's, it's a looser sense of identity, a person's moral self, maybe we might say, or a person's practical self, or what the person is like, what values do they have?
Yeah, perhaps in a more intuitive sort of folk psychology kind of way of putting it, I would say the essence of the person changed in a way. Sometimes that's the way people think and talk about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say I do want to kind of tie responsibility to the moral sense of self, say, but I want to divorce it from the numerical identity sense of self. So if you think of like someone goes to university and they have this kind of experience in which they kind of like maybe reject some of the previous values that they had that were a result of their upbringing, and they come to kind of really find themselves and they say, well, I'm no longer the same person. So that's kind of this moral sense that has to do with kind of the psychological content that the person has, your values, your concerns, and things like that. But on the other hand, like the legal system, when they're trying to determine like who did the crime, they don't care about that, right? If you say, well, look, that was when I went to college, or that was before I went to college, before I was a different person, but now I'm a different person, that's not going to work. Sorry, my light turned off again. That's not going to get you off the hook. So I think we have both these notions that we appeal to in daily life. And then, so my claim is that that strict sense, that kind of legal sense of identity, is not the one that's relevant to punishment. What matters more is, what is the person like now? Like, do they still have these criticizable psychological states or not?
Okay, so I have two more questions here. I mean, in fact, it's one question, but it's two parts to the same question. So going back to moral responsibility itself, when it comes to attributions of moral responsibility, how do we determine if an individual is blameworthy or praiseworthy?
So we've talked about some of this. So on my view, synchronic responsibility, to put my view kind of succinctly. So on my view, synchronic responsibility is a matter of the quality of will, the person's quality of will at the time of action, and then responsibility across time, or diachronic responsibility, is a matter of the persistence of those qualities of will.
Right. And do you think that this way of approaching things would also apply to collectives and not just individuals?
So yes, I think that it does. I think that this kind of basic picture can apply to collectives as well. So collectives are groups of people organized in more or less structured ways. So like nations, governments, corporations. So I defend a kind of attitude-based account of responsibility, on which responsibility is like largely a function of the person's attitudes or psychological states. And then to kind of engage the question of collectives, as a first step, it kind of seems to make sense to think that some collectives can have various attitudes, like beliefs, desires, and values, right? So we frequently attribute attitudes to collectives like governments and corporations, right? We might say that this government has this particular goal, right? I mean, think of like a government's platform where they're like, this is what we want to do, right? That I think that you can understand that as being a desire of the collective or the beliefs of the collective. Furthermore, like we frequently might criticize a corporation by saying, look, I saw those commercials that this corporation did about carrying, they maybe washed an oil-covered duck with some soap, but really that corporation might not care so much about the environment despite this PR campaign, right? And then like mission statements, which you can find on the website of any like giant corporation, seem like they're declarations of what they tell us are their deeply held values or beliefs. And then they might be kind of authentic or inauthentic, or we might raise those questions. So it seems like at least suitably structured collectives can have attitudes, or at least a close enough analog to attitudes like beliefs, desires, values, and then they can act on them. They can act on those attitudes. They can act on the basis of their beliefs so as to realize their desires. I mean, that's what these collectives do. And then some of those attitudes might have moral content. So we might be able to evaluate kind of whether we think those priorities of the collective are defensible or indefensible. So in that sense, it seems like collectives that have the capacity for goal-directed behavior, which requires some degree of structure, kind of maybe a hierarchical structure. So it seems to make sense. Kind of the idea here is that that corporations or collectives can have a quality of will, and responsibility just is an evaluation of quality of will. And then, just like as with individuals, we can think about whether those qualities of will, whether those values, desires, beliefs persist over time or don't persist. Right? Does a corporation still have, say, those problematic values, or has it turned over a new leaf? So I think that the kind of this basic theoretical framework that I've been describing for thinking about responsibility in terms of quality of will, I think that it does apply to collectives as well as individuals.
Great. So just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, sure. So a good place to find me is on philpapers.org. And if you type in my name, I have a profile there. You can find my papers, many of which are freely available. You can also find me on Google Scholar, as well as my university webpage, or my university profile.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I'm leaving links to that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Khoury, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ricardo. You can also find me on Google Scholar, as well as my university webpage, or my university profile.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I'm leaving links to that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Khoury, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ricardo.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.